a big area.
Right, you're rolling.
I think everybody's kind of arrived.
Yeah.
It's probably
Yep.
also
Not
they
Hill.
won't be missing much.
Dunk as well.
Right.
Thank you very much for coming in this in this grimmest day, grimmest weather you can
I was
imagine.
here
But
already.
well done, and yeah, somebody. And also thank you very much to the GHC for inviting me to give this talk about ultralight gliders, Hutters, and Pegasus. And I'm trying to remember the name of the glider I'm talking about. But ultralight gliders, obviously, I'm a big fan. I'm very enthusiastic about ultralight, anything lightweight sport aircraft or lightweight gliders. So thank you very much. Now to get into the what I'll do is just give you a sort of overview of where we're going. Just the basic. So we're going to look at Barry Shaw. He did a beautiful half-scale model of the Pegasus, the Penrose Pegasus, and it's worth kind of studying that in a bit more detail because it's so accurate. And of course we don't have a full scale example today, and perhaps we're going to do something about that.
I actually read earlier today that they built a second Pegasus,
Oh right.
and it's actually in and flew it in 1993, and it's in the Suffolk and Norfolk. Suffolk.
John Lee's.
Yeah, that's John Lee's
built.
Pegasus.
Okay.
We'll cover that in quite a bit of detail in talk because he changed quite a bit. On it. Obviously, he had a real dialogue with Penrose, who was still alive then, and John was obviously a big fan of the Pegasus. But he changed a lot, and then of course I think if we're thinking of doing another one, the general feeling is that it should be as authentic or as close to the original drawings as possible. And anyway, we'll discuss that at the end. I don't know what you guys feel, but then there are questions, and we'll get into that. For example, tow hook. Does a square fuselage lend itself to a tow hook? You know, with all that stress under the seat and everything. Andrew Jarvis is very much in favour of making an accurate replica, but I think we should try and make it. If that's the case, we should try and make it as accurate as possible. But We'll go into Bill Manuel and his Ladybird, which then leads into John Lee, because I met John Lee as a result of John inheriting the tailplane, the fuselage and tailplane of Bill Manuel's Ladybird, which is a little ultralight, and so that was how I got to meet John and Bill back in about 1984, I think it was. Then we'll talk about John's Pegasus, then the two Hutters, of course. So in fact, we have two Hutters here now, thanks to Nick. So we have two Hutters here in the collection, which is very good news. A very lovely, very interesting aircraft to fly. Very unique because it's so light. And of course the Pegasus was like that too. It was very light, I think 120 pounds empty weight, which is very, very light for a glider. Then we'll talk about John's creations. He produced a lot of aircraft, an extraordinary number of aircraft, John Lee, which was I think an amazing achievement. But then we'll get into a discussion about the spar of the Pegasus versus the spar of the Hutter. And we had some quite objective lessons when we structure tested the spar of the Hutter. And I think that points favourably towards the Penrose Pegasus wing, and I'll explain why. Then we'll talk about the L6 Mouse, which was John's little ultralight glider that had the Bill Manuel's fuselage and tail, slightly modified, and we talk about those modifications. Some of them perhaps a little scary. And talking about scary events, John nearly had an incident bungee launching in the L6 off the Devil's Dyke and the South Downs, and I'll show you the photographs that relate to that. So, of course, there's all this befuddling technology which is going to completely interrupt everything while I try and figure out what button to press next. So let's start to tell. If you can we hit the light? Sort of. Great. Let's see if we can get this thing to work. Actually, there's a few more that I haven't mentioned. We talked about the L4 In our overview, I'm going to talk about a German glider, which means going back to not 1936 but 1925, so like 11 years earlier. An interesting design, particularly relating to the wing, and some very remarkable flights done in that aircraft. So we'll talk about that, mainly because of its interesting wing. But of course, inevitable, Germans rather a long way ahead of us. No surprise. Then we'll go back to John Lee's Pegasus, and then we'll turn to John Greenfield's lovely model of the Pegasus, and get into a kind of a discussion about costs and materials and things like that, if we have time. So let's get the ball rolling here. This is John Greenfield's model. I think is absolutely stunning. It's a beautiful example, and it communicates. You know, it's like sort of time travel. It communicates something from the past to the present, which is really what this museum's all about. So, I think it's exciting. You know, the prospect of trying to bring a full-scale one of these alive. But having said that, there are some. You know, this question going into the questions about the details. John Greenfield, he has added something. I don't know if you noticed that. You see there's a sort of like drag wires coming from the nose to the top of the struts. Mm-hmm. Now I can't see that on the drawings or any of the photographs. I don't know if anyone has seen. Did that occur at some stage with Penrose when he was flying? Did he add the? Has anyone seen that before? I don't think so. I think that because John Greenfield was aerotowing it, which is quite a wild thing for a model to be aerotowed by something quite powerful, especially with a low tow hook position, so the glider would tend to pitch up, and I think he was worried about the wings getting dragged off backwards or something. I don't know if that's an authentic explanation for that or not. And then we raised the question, was it a good idea? I mean, maybe, because we'll get more into this, but there's some really nice features about the Pegasus. Penrose believed in a kind of a belt and braces system, and let me see if I can get the slide, the little laser pointer here working. He believed in belt and braces, so you see, obviously this is a three-piece wing. That's a continuous spar going all the way through, and the advantage of that is that the sort of bending loads that come in between here, obviously that's a straight cantilevering load, classic cantilever wing, but inside here you've got a bending load, and what you've got is a continuous spar cap which goes all the way from one side to the other, which is beautifully simple, but you've got the disadvantage of three pieces rather than two-piece wing, but three smaller pieces, so for home building that might be a good thing. And that's always been a problem with home-built gliders. How can you fit a glider, you know, in your garage because the wings are too big? You know, and then some people. I would describe this as probably the Pete and Paul of gliding. Pete and Paul was a beautiful little 1930s ultralight design that would fly on about 40 horsepower, 50 horsepower. And I would describe the Penrose Pegasus as a sort of Pete and Paul of gliding. Something that people could build in their garage. But regarding this question of the wing spar, what is the advantage of this? Well, basically, when this is all under bending from the high G, say you're pulling 3G in a turn, and you'd like to know whether there's a margin, at least another G of margin. You'd like to feel that, wouldn't you? Like to think, you know, and what's going on in here, and how stable is it? Well, there's obviously a lot of bending, a lot of compression going on in here, and what's actually happening at the wing root? Is it helping or not really doing anything? Well, I would argue that it helps immensely to have a continuous spar along the top to stabilise that inboard area. Because what we discovered with the Hutter when we loaded it up with sandbags, and that was that we saw something quite alarming, and I'll come to that a little bit later on when we get to the Hutter. And it's because of that, it was a very objective lesson about structures, that I'm now a big fan of this configuration, especially for amateur building. What else? What other features are fairly obvious? Well, this very simple flat fuselage, flat-sided square box fuselage, that's certainly easy to make. I think everyone will agree with that. That's not a complex thing to make compared to the Hutter. What about this though? Here's the belly hook. Now you've got the belly hook attached to a flat piece of plywood, you know, mahogany ply. You have to beef up, you'd have to have some fairly strong members up inside that for that belly hook to take any serious load. You know, if you imagine about twice the all-up weight of the aircraft hanging on the belly hook upside down, that's the kind of stress we're looking at. So that's one of the problems with the box, that's the downside. This simple little skid, I'd love to hear what you feel about that. I think it's lovely. One of the things I like about it is there's lots of suspension, so you don't get shocks going up. You know, with these spring-loaded, very seriously good suspension, you don't get shocks going up into this bulkhead, the F2 bulkhead. I think that's a nice feature. There's also the possibility you can put a small little plastic wheel on the back there, which would act as a dolly, which is a really nice thing if you're out in a hard field. We did that with the Hutter, on my Hutter in Italy. The ground was always very hard in Italy, so we just had a small little wheel on the back, and it was really easy to move the Hutter around without a dolly. So that's a little practical feature. You can say, yeah, but one of the problems with that is that if you do a heavy landing, the dolly can punch up onto the back of the fuselage and make a hole. And in the case of the Hutter, we did have some, not so much punching, but it did scratch on the fuselage a few times. But it could do damage to the little longerons, that central longeron on the Hutter, that you don't notice. So there's a big downside to those kind of modifications. And John Lee was very disapproving of it. He didn't like me doing that on the Hutter in Italy. So I realised, and I understand where John was coming from. You can get damage that you then don't notice, and obviously that's not a good thing with gliders. But with this, because it's a box, you could actually just cut a hole there and then just have a piece of fabric or a piece of lightweight plywood, which could easily punch through, and then you'd be able to see the damage if it was there. So you'd be able to understand what had happened. You damaged a harmless piece of the glider. I don't know what you feel about that, or is that a bit of a ridiculous idea? But anyway, that's really just pointing at what you're going to do if you're going to have a square fuselage. You've got to get the loads from the skid out to the strong points. Now on the drawings, which we'll come to the drawings in a minute, you'll see that little V, those V struts are slightly different, and for good reason. So we'll have a look at that. What other features? Probably you can see how small the cockpit area is. So for a practical glider, what John Lee did was he scaled up the front end of the glider. But then you get away from the authenticity and the history. So that's another difficult question. You know, only a limited people, Jules, you'll be able to fly it. You know, only a limited number of people will be able to fly it. But I think that is still worthwhile. Because it would be an authentic example. Do you see what I mean? You could always build a second fuselage of larger scale, so keeping the wings, because I don't think there'll be much consequence. You could just scale up everything by 10% to make bigger area for bigger pilots with a second fuselage, maybe. But it's still probably the biggest downside of the glider is that this is very confined. What are the other key points? There's a point here you notice that on the models there's a bit more space here in the rear wing attachment onto the fuselage, and I think that on both the models, I'll show you another one in a minute, that's just simply so you can get your fingers in there. On a half scale model it's hard to get your fingers in there, so the model has just figured that they needed more space there. On the drawings there's less space there because, you know, you basically, the operator is scaled down by half, if you see what I mean. Can you get his fingers in there more easily? So going on to the tail, all flying tail, which is not everybody's cup of tea. I like them. They're very nice for low speed. and if you're on the ridge and you're wafting and you're a little bit close to the bushes and stuff like that, and if there are hang gliders and things coming up towards you, it's nice to have really good control authority. And I learned that in John Lee's L6. It had the tail feathers designed by Bill Manuel, so what do you expect? It was lovely to fly. But there's a downside, particularly to the all-flying tail. You've got to be a bit careful about the runaway control, mast balancing, or some kind of, I think the K6s have an anti-servo tab. Ray, is that right? Your
No.
K6?
No.
No anti-servo tab?
No.
But it's just, you have a spring loading in the circuit, is that right? In the
It doesn't
trimmer.
have a spring for
Yeah.
Yeah.
feel. It's only for feel.
But it does stabilise the tail
Right. Yeah.
because it's pivoted at 25%. So
Yeah.
any spring in the system must stabilise the pitch.
Okay. Does the spring tension, does its tension stick forwards or backwards?
You can adjust it.
Or you can adjust either way. All right. Yeah.
It's got a trimmer on it.
Okay. Yeah. So you can, and the trimmer is adjusting the position of the spring.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. In the Hutter, I mean, Nick's Hutter feels like it's got this really nice natural stick-free stability and pitch, which is a lovely quality of any glider. You know, you can relax on the stick and the pitch will stay there. My Hutter, for some reason, even though I've checked the geometry and the stick movement and the elevator deflections and everything, my Hutter doesn't feel like that. It feels unstable in pitch. If you let go of the stick, it just wants to lurch one way or the other.
The K6 is like that.
Is that right? So it does feel a bit unstable,
You don't
stick
let go
free,
of the stick.
unstick. Really? Right, okay. Because my K6 is the old one, which has the elevator, and it's completely benign. It was very, very relaxing to fly. In fact, I go to sleep in it. That's my problem with the K6. It's too easy to fly, really. So anyway, I think it's a fascinating subject because, you know, control feel is all part of the fun of flying, and certainly for me, the control lightness and the control liveliness, or the control power, if you like, is almost more important than anything. I care more about that than glide angle, because that's what you're doing most of the time as you're tussling into the core of a thermal, which I think is the greatest fun in gliding. Obviously, modern gliding has gone down a different route. It's much more aimed at glide angle and speed and weight and performance and covering great distance, which is a different style of flying completely, really. Which is a good thing for us, because otherwise the thermals around Lasham would be horribly crowded, and if you've got a wing over your head and you're in your thermaling, especially if you're at the core of the thermal and there are big machines all around you. So luckily they've all gone off to Scotland, the high performance gliders, and the thermals aren't too crowded. So you know, I think that this kind of flying, it complements the modern kind of flying. Going into this, I could go on for ages about the tailplane, but I don't want to bore you too much. But the rudder, not very much aerodynamic balance, and then we'll get into some more details about this rudder, because I've got a few questions which I want to, which I'll present to you a bit later. But otherwise, we're going to spend too long on this slide. I'm going to crack on. This is by a modeler in the Slovakia. Is that how you pronounce it? Slovakia now? And I couldn't pronounce his name, I'm afraid, so forgive me for not being able to pronounce his name, but another absolutely superb half-scale model. He's got the kind of mahogany look of the fuselage, and from this picture you can see the rather steep angle of the struts. Do you see what I mean? Compared to, say, the struts on the Hutter or the Grenadier Baby. And that's simply because this centre section is quite short. So that means the struts can be lighter, they're more stable because they're not so long. So it just means the technicality of making the struts, that's not such a problem. And probably what I did fail to mention in the last slide is what Harold Penrose was trying to achieve was this belt and braces. He felt that the strut could fall off, a pin could even come out, and the cantilevering of the centre section would mean that your wing is still fine. It's still braced on the other side. Do you see what I mean? So that is for a home build. That's a great feature. Belt and braces in the primary structure. I think that's really good. And I don't know. I'm just reading, and I want to recommend this book because if anyone who hasn't read it, Adventure with Fate, which is his experience as a test pilot with Westlands. And there are, I mean, talk about character building stuff. They had problems with, and no doubt his kind of belt and braces philosophy definitely came from being a test pilot for Westlands, because of course everything can go wrong in a big complex. I think it was a 2-engined or 3-engine aircraft, and the wheels, it was rather like a Ford tri-motor, and they took off, and one of the wheels, it kind of had compression legs that went up into the engine area, and then it had a kind of a V-strut which went onto the fuselage, and the compression strut that had the suspension in it just came unattached from the wing. They took off and the wheel just hung down, and so obviously they had to come back in for an emergency landing, but by extraordinary, if you like, belt and braces, and it obviously wasn't intentional, the strut didn't actually change its geometry, even though the strut that had come off, it didn't change its geometry. So when they landed, the wheel came up and the end of the strut went back into the fitting and knocked the airplane landed safely. So what is the chances of that, But anyway, I think, encoded into his design is a philosophy of simplicity. And clearly he'd been terrified quite a few times by all the complexity that was coming up by the designers at Westlands. So here's another point. There's an open area there. I think that's something that probably, I think maybe in the next slide we can see that a bit better. Yeah. This slide, same glider, but you see how that's open. I think that would have to have a cover over it. Is that right? You could basically, the wind would blow, in a glider, if you, at 60 knots, particularly on an aerotow or something like that, you could end up blowing the fabric out the back of the fuselage. So some sort of little cover, but that's not a big deal, the bulkhead in there. You can see the instruments, just 2 instruments on the outside. It's so cramped, the cockpit is so cramped, the instruments have got to be on the outside. I think probably, Penrose had already met Robert Cronfield at the South Downs when he brought over was it the Wren, the Cronfield's glider that he brought over in 1930, or I'm trying to remember what it's called.
The Wren.
The Wren, was it the Wren? Yeah, and
not the Wren. It was the Wren, wasn't it?
The Wren. Was it? How do you pronounce it?
I don't know how you pronounce it.
Yeah, the Wren.
The Wren.
And they did these stunning flights. And Penrose had flown a light plane. He'd flown a plane down there. Quite a few people actually flown down. They're all parking these light planes in a field down at the bottom of the downs, and someone at Itford or somewhere it was. And they obviously met Cronfield, and I think Cronfield's glider had these instruments like that. So I think this is probably a kind of a tribute. This is Penrose's tribute to Robert Cronfield, probably. Outside of it. But anyway, here again you see the struts. Very steep angle, short compression area here, so nice and stable. Easy to make because you don't really have to change the thickness of the spar cap, particularly the top spar cap. What other features? I think I've pretty much covered that. Any questions so far about this?
The instruments are probably in that position so that the cockpit can be smaller around him instead of having a collar.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's all a question of economy, and I think was what really. There was an article recently in the American Experimental Aircraft Association magazine, Sport Flying, and it was just talking about. It was written by a very experienced guy. He was a pilot for the space shuttle and stuff like that. And now he's involved with the EAA. But you said that simplicity. You said that perfection in a design isn't the point at which you don't need to add anything more. His point was that in an aircraft, perfection is the point where there's nothing more that you need to take away. In other words, you're not lugging around a lot of machinery that might be pretty redundant, and that might actually be more of a hazard than a safety benefit, particularly to the operators. If the operator doesn't understand it, whatever. And of course the shuttle lugged a huge amount of expensive equipment around. Can you imagine someone who flew the shuttle would know that problem very, very clearly. So he was a great advocate of simplicity, this particular guy in the EAA. And he was quoting, and I can never pronounce his name properly, but he wrote some lovely books in poetry and stuff. Antoine Saint-Exupéry, is it Saint-Exupéry? How do you pronounce it?
Saint-Exupéry.
Saint-Exupéry, Saint-Exupéry, yeah. So that was basically that one. That quote comes from him. So yes, simplicity, really elegant, great simplicity and elegance in that spar arrangement. The struts, the complexity of building the struts is reduced. The square fuselage, it all makes a much easier project to build, but without necessarily compromising the flying qualities. I mean, the Hutter, I haven't flown anything like this, but I've flown the Hutter, which I believe would be very similar to this. So, and the Hutter is lovely to fly, as Nick will testify, and because a lot of you will testify. Hutter's very, very interesting to fly because it's got such little inertia in roll. Obviously this wing, I mean, this gets us really to the subject of the Hutter, the comparison between this and the Hutter. This wing is much easier to build. This aileron is much more straightforward. It's all straight lines. The Hutter's a very different story. So that's another point. Simplicity paying off here. You can see this big gap here. Well, that's not quite as per the drawings, but we've already covered that. Now we get to the question of this rudder. I would argue that possibly there's a missing rib, diagonal rib there. And I don't know what you feel about that, because the way I interpret that is that the rudder forces come in from the pedals, from the pilot's feet, go into the bottom of the rudder spar or the rudder post. It would go up into this rib very nicely, but then that's just the rudder spar taking the bending loads, carrying the bending loads up the rudder. So you're relying on the rudder spar and the fabric to stop this just twisting off. Do you see what I mean? So that I think is a question that needs to be addressed. That would be, I don't know what you feel about that, but it wouldn't add weight. It's not adding much complexity. It would take the stress off this little rather critical area. Obviously you've got a D box here, plywood D box, so that'll take bending load, no problem. Are you with me? Do you see what I mean? Yeah. But down here, you're just relying on a plank in torsion load like that, which I think is a bit marginal. And that brings us to the whole subject of VA. A lot of these aircraft, there's no handbook, so no one knows what VA is. But the manoeuvring speed, at what point can you just bang on full control deflection? And we'll come to that a bit more, because it's not like, even in the modern world, are the modern manufacturers, devoid of problems relating to VA. Anyway, let's get to the next one. Drawing. We won't linger on this too much. I mean, I love drawing. I'm just really into old-fashioned style draftsmanship, and I think this is a superb drawing. Just trying to remember the name of this guy. Barry Shaw did this drawing. Very accurate. It's in imperial units, so probably need to go to be easier in digital. So then all these things can be fed into machines for the bits to be cut. But yeah, the drawing speaks for itself. So there's lots of details. Again, you can see where I think that rib needs to be added. You can see we mentioned earlier the where the springs go in. The springs go into this strong steel cross member going across there. So it's a slightly shallower angle, which is a good thing for the compression. On the models, on both the models, the springs go out the sides, and that's just a practical modelling solution. Certainly isn't a criticism, because those models are absolutely superb. So certainly not a criticism of the models. What other? You can see the straight, easy to build centre section, the most important area of stress, if you like. Much shorter moment arm on that area, so this is a much less critical area. And Andrew Jarvis brought up this question about what does this really look like. It's a little bit hard you really have to get a magnifying glass to look at this detail about the metal fittings where the wings join up there. Obviously, very important in terms for the integrity of the design. So on the next slide, we look at that in a bit more detail. This is just my interpretation of it. I've exaggerated the size of the plates a little bit, just for clarity in the drawing. It looks a bit more like a drawing from a Keelcraft model. But there's the strut connection. And item 1 here is this plate. It's sandwiched under item 2, which is this outer plate, which then links up with the plate on the outer section of the wing. So this is the outer section of the wing here. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? You see what I mean? So, and that's what this plate looks like. So it's a very neat way of integrating the forces in very reliably. You get the forces well integrated onto the plate, and then distributed out onto the spar caps. We'll come to the subject of spar caps, and that leads us on to build manual and that whole subject. Any questions on that? Any questions? Basically, that's just looking at the plates and the drawings. So we won't harp on too much about the drawings because it's quite difficult to see it from where you are. You really can't get, unless we zoom in, and then that's going to take up the whole talk. Zoomed in on these drawings. We'll carry on with the slides. This brings us to build manual. Build manual's lovely Ladybird. This was flown at Popham, and I think in 1983, and probably maybe some people know better than me, but I think it was 1983. Bill was flying. And I think that may have been the year he met John Lee. I'm a little bit vague on these dates, but or 1982, 1983. Whether they were sharing a workshop, they were certainly sharing a workshop by the end of 1983. So that might have been built in the shared workshop between John Lee and Bill Manuel. But this little aircraft was being test flown by Barbara Reed. A lot of you remember Barbara Reed. And it came to grief at Popham. And only the tail of the Ladybird survived. And Bill donated that to John Lee. So John Lee's next machine, which is the glider, inherited this tail. So we'll get into the subject of this tail because John modified that a bit. Anyway, I just think that's a lovely picture, very characteristic of Bill Manuel. Some of you will remember Bill Manuel, but he's a real character. And of course, we have several of his machines here. We've got the more recently built one as well, which was the one that he built in the 1980s. But just while we're on the subject of the Ladybird, there's a Ladybird 2, which was restored by Julian, I'm trying to remember his name now, Julian Aubert, who works with the, he's quite involved in the museum at Brooklands, and that's where I think he restored or did a lot of the work. Julian Aubert looks after the rotary engines and things like that for the Shuttleworth, not Shuttleworth, sorry, the Brooklands Museum. He's quite an expert on engines. He helped us with the engine for our Flying Flea here. Anyway, Bill then, after this one got crashed at Popham, Bill scratch built another one. That was the Ladybird 2. Julian Aubert still has the Ladybird 2. It's in a trailer, and he's very keen to give it to us. And I've spoken to, Glyn, you and I have chatted a bit about this. Obviously, it's a petrol, got an engine, can't go in the hangar. It's a little aeroplane. It's not really a vintage glider, but it is an airworthy example of Bill Manuel's work, an entirely authentic airworthy example of Bill Manuel. So I think I'm going to propose that perhaps we keep it here, but in a trailer, and perhaps we get it out on exhibition days. I don't know what you feel about that, Glyn.
It would have to be discussed by the committee.
Sure.
Yeah.
It has to have a good trailer.
Yeah, it has got a good trailer because I think it lives outside at the moment. But anyway, it does fly. It is airworthy. It has been flown. Julian Aubert has flown it. There's some lovely film you can get on the internet of Julian flying the little Ladybird 2. So that's an airworthy Bill Manuel machine, which I think is very exciting. Anyway, let's go forward a bit more. This then leads us to that John Lee was already sharing a workshop at some stage. Certainly when the second half, certainly when that second half of the Ladybird, the tailplane Ladybird, was given to John. So this is the John Lee's Pegasus, the Penrose Pegasus. His customized, I think probably might be the right word, customized version of it. There's a few important differences. You can't see the struts, but it's more of a like a Grenadier Baby or Prefect type wing. It's a two wings. It's not a three-piece wing. And possibly John didn't get. Possibly he was put off by those wing strut fitting questions, or quite why he went for the long wing, or he just had enough workshop. He had enough workshop space. He thought he could build it better. Not quite sure why he went for it, but he also changed the wing design quite a bit. A lot more ribs, larger area here, larger nose, bigger opening, which is quite a good idea. But then you're moving away from the authentic, Pegasus design. Slightly, this bulkhead here is different from the drawings. If you look at this, you can see there's some cross members here, which don't show in the drawings. You can see these diagonals that go down here and here. On the drawings, the diagonals go the other way. So John changed that for some reason. And I have to check. I don't know if John put in a tow hook or not. And that's may be why he was beefing up this area with more diagonals and stuff like that, in order to be able to fit a tow hook on the bottom of a square fuselage. But anyway, John he didn't have the little V struts. He had a more conventional type rubber power slide that we normally have on the vintage gliders. Then going back to the tailplane, the elevator might have had a little bit more aerodynamic area in front of the hinges, so more aerodynamic balancing, and that presented a problem for John when he was aerotowing. He found that it would PIO, very scary. Got into a very scary PIO with it, and he solved it later on by putting mass balances that stuck out the front there, but it raises the whole question about whether these kind of aircraft are suitable for aerotowing without quite careful consideration, particularly on this question of VA. Obviously, it's quite hard to prove what VA is, but if someone is flying, at VA on an aerotow without, having not established what the VA is, and you hit turbulence, obviously there's big question marks of what's going to happen. John added aerodynamic area to the rudder, which I don't think presents much of a problem. He got rid of the solid plywood area, which I think was probably not a bad idea. That Penrose used the solid ply area, which is a little heavy using solid ply up here. So Penrose used a big solid area of plate at the top of the rudder, but then for weight reasons probably just didn't put in this cross member here. So I would economize on weight there, and put a cross member in there. In fact, I can't see it. I think John has actually put in that cross member. Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah, so John figured that out. Very good idea. Basically, it means that you're not putting all the strain on that little piece of the plank, if you like. Okay, let's move on, because I'm going to run hopelessly out of time here. Here's a Hutter that Johnny built too. You can see how different the fuselage is. Quite complex to make. The wing, that is all complex. John did a beautiful job, a difficult thing to make, but he was a master wood craftsman, especially having sort of studied, if you like, under Bill Manuel. So metal struts, because it's easy to find old T31 struts, and that was a quite kind of sort of economic thing. Obviously, because of the cantilever wing, the struts are longer. But talking of teeth, this was taken at Lasham in about 1988, and just by amazing coincidence, there's a yellow T31 in the background here. By extraordinary coincidence. So of course I'm very happy about that. So anyway, this one is here. This glider is here, and it is airworthy. BGA are just presenting a little bit of a problem trying to find technical details of it, even though it does have the BGA number, etc., etc. But I won't get into that 'cause I'll probably start ranting about it, so try not to start the rants quite this early. This is a drawing that I did. John sadly no longer with us, and I did this as a sort of tribute to him in his last months, if you like. And it's a record, not even a complete record of all the things he built. There are 2 aircraft missing here. He built 2 Hutters, and I neglected to draw 2 Hutters. I should have thought of that. Then there was a predecessor to this one, which was called the Sky Streaker, which we could call the L2. So the L1, I'm not sure what it looked like, so I didn't draw it. But John flew this. It was car launch from Fields. He got it flying. Very much an empirical piece of design. It wasn't drawn on a drawing board. It was just he just grew it in the workshop. I think he started with the seat. And Bill Manuel, that was Bill Manuel's approach as well. He would start with maybe the rear bulkhead and then the seat and then and he would just grow a glider. Bill was like that. And Bill said the problem with the drawing board was you idealise too much and then you end up never building it. It's too expensive and takes projects too long. Okay, you get a fancy set of drawings, but it never gets me. Whereas if you enjoy building, you'll probably finish the project. There's a lot to be said for that. So we could call that sort of empirical designing. And you can see that's a very old-fashioned style of doing things. I mean, the way the ancient Greeks built boats, but very good boats, and trading in the ancient Greek era, going back to pre-Mycenaean, and we're talking about 4,000 years ago. The Mediterranean is full of shipwrecks that go back at least 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. 4,000 years, and they were obviously empirical designs. So I'm not sure we build aircraft, a bit like Greek fishing boats. But what I'm saying is that there's the relationship between the artisan and the design is important. We'll come on to that a bit later. But then there's after the L2, there's the L3, which is this one, based on the Wilma Jensen, which was an ultralight developed in the 1970s in America. John incorporated a more sensible seating arrangement, but it gave John experience on these big deep spars, which was obviously a sensible way to go. The next project John did, I think the next one was this one, which was the L4, which was a biplane glider using the tailplane salvage from a Skylark, I think it was, but a highly manoeuvrable little aircraft. We'll come to that a little bit more. Then the L5, which was this little ultralight, we'll come to photographs of that. 2-seater ultralight with a little pusher engine. Can't remember what the engine was, but it was about sort of 35-40 horsepower. Then the L6, which is, I met John when he was test flying this, and I was fortunate enough to fly it. And we'll come to more, we've got some more photographs of that, we'll talk more about that. Then the L7, which was this composite fiberglass glider, and it could carry 2 people. It was a trainer, and Howard Turode was involved in some of the structure testing of it. I think Howard Turode actually flew it. Howard Turode had a terrific relationship with Bill Manuel. So it was through Bill Manuel John got to know Howard Turode, and Howard sort of guided the process of the development a little bit of the L7. It was a small 2-seater, very, very strong composite glider built from plastic, and uncharacteristic of John's work, it was made in plastic, but it was incredibly strong, and Howard Turode will testify to that. So then we come on to obviously the Hutters. He built 2 Hutters. Then this is the replica of the Penrose Pegasus, and this is finally John's last project, which was the wings to the Colditz Cock replica that flew for the Channel 4. Some of you did anyone see that Colditz Cock? See it flying at the? You see that? Yeah. And it flew very well. John flew it. Derek Piggott did the test flight on it, and some of the old guys that were there actually helped build it in Colditz. Were there as well. So an incredible piece of history. Very, very amazing piece of history. So, moving on. This is John. I could harp on at length about this, but this is what we're talking about: the spars of the Hutter. You see how light the spar caps are. And I got a lecture from Bill Manuel when I first met him on the Devil's Dyke, you know, when John was flying the L6 back in this is back in the winter of 1984. Bill, almost within about 5 minutes of meeting him, got into a subject. He was criticising, because he saw me as part of the hang gliding fraternity, and he said, well, you guys suffer from, you know, putting all your weight and all your strength and stuff in these tubes. And he says, no good. You need proper spars. So he gave me a lecture about what a proper spar should be, and he said, you know, you've got to have spar caps. And so, if you like, Bill Manuel really woke me up to this. I mean, I was working with some guys who unfortunately, one of the guys was actually killed with the Euler buckling in a microlight. And he was one of the manufacturers. Guys, the two of us, and I was working for one of these manufacturers, and Steve Hunt was his name. Was it Steve Hunt? Who was the racing driver? Which one was the one? Steve Hunt, yeah. I think it was Steve Hunt. He manufactured an ultralight that with tubes, and the wings collapsed. A little powered ultralight collapsed under Euler buckling. So, and that had happened just a few months before I met Bill. So Bill was in a way, he was kind of preaching to the converted, because that was one of the reasons I was so interested in John Lee, because I thought, here's someone building proper wings. This is what the microlight and the ultralight community ought to be waking up to. So that was why I was so interested in what John was doing. The Hutter wing, well, we've kind of we talked about that. Basically, when we tested it, it was upside down. We put sandbags on it in the Ken Fripp's or Mike Fripp's workshop over on the north side here at Asham, and we discovered it bending alarmingly when we did it the way we were recommended to do it. It was just to test the outboard section. And if you do that, you put an enormous amount, because this wing is the right way up. That puts a very large. If you only test the outboard section, and the wing is upside down, then what happens is you put too much stress on this thin side. So you have to put all the sandbags on, not just the outboard section. So anyway, I mean, perhaps we'll, you know, come and talk to me about that afterwards, because it's quite a long story. But the point is, that's why I'm so adamant that the Penrose Pegasus wing is a better solution. It's stronger, it's simpler for amateur building, and you don't run into those problems that the Hutter wing has. Nick, I think your wing obviously passed that test, because that's why we were doing it, and your wing was beefed up by Scott when he made it, because he wanted to do aerobatics. That's why he put on the longer ailerons, which is one of the reasons why Nick's Hutter flies a lot nicer than mine, because of the longer ailerons. It's got a lovely crisp rail feel. But of course, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but did Scott rather, Scott Viking, sorry, Scott, did he plan to do people aerobat the Hutters in those days? Certainly,
Not that I know of.
it handles very like an aerobatic. So the temptation to do a loop or a stall turn or something, of course, is very strong in something like a Hutter. The only problem with the Hutter is it's got a tiny little rudder, so we'll come to that subject in a minute. And as John warned me, the rudder's very small. No one knows if these things can get out of spins, because they did get a reputation for spinning. So that's a problem with the small rudder in the Hutter. So then coming back to John Lee in the L6, this is the L6. So this is, you recognise, you saw the photograph of that in Bill Manuel's workshop. Those are the same tail feathers that John Lee inherited from Bill Manuel, but he added this area. You see in the red, that was all added because John figured proportionally it needed these bigger areas. It was a bigger aircraft than the Ladybird. Very lightweight, no plywood on the leading edge there. It's just a little box spar, so incredibly lightweight construction. Likewise, only a box spar on the rudder. Beautifully made, and it flew beautifully. This was flying from, I was going to say from Tide, but it's not. It's from, let me just check. There's a field just east of the Devil's Dyke, New Timber Hill. Just east of the Devil's Dyke. Great big long field with a sea breeze, so it was a nice stable wind. It was good for test flying. And we were just car launching it. You can see there there's a handle up at the top there. That was a total recovery parachute. John now had added this fairing in the earlier photographs the fairing wasn't there. Anyway, we better crack on because we're run out of time here. But, again, you can see the fairing. You can see some of these features. Again, you can see this shows off the tailplane, the inherited tailplane. These are the modifications, and that I think on the tailplane that really made sense. But the L6 had a funny characteristic in flight. As he flew along, there was a kind of strange wobbling, like a hang glider pilot who was hovering over your tail and was reaching down and was shaking the top of the rudder like that as a joke. You know, it was a real kind of gremlin type feeling. You think, what is doing that? And I think it was a bit of wake turbulence coming off the wing and possibly getting under the tailplane, but interfering with the tailplane at certain speeds, and it would wobble, or it was coming off the rudder. Maybe the fuselage was flexing too much, and the rudder was causing the fuselage, because it's quite a tall rudder, and that was one of the modifications. You know, and much later reflection, I think that the way John modified that rudder, I see that you see that in a second, but this also, we'll come back to the rudder in a moment. You can see how light the plywood is here, because you get that star force effect. Hang gliders are flying, ridge soaring quite high, so there's quite a stiff breeze there. So there's obviously somebody holding that wingtip down, because talking about a glider is only 120 pounds. It would flip, it would blow away in a flash. So I think we tent pegged the wingtip down to take this photograph. But in the evening sun, in January or February, I think it was. Again, so this was my introduction to ultralight gliders. Was really through John. You can see again that very light plywood construction. I mean, the light plywood makes it easier for getting the radius around the leading edge, which is quite a difficult thing to do, to get that right, to get that accurate on the leading edge when you're building a wing. But that makes it easier. But then you still get the starved horse effect. You need more ribs. And you see the rudder. You see the rudder is quite tall. This is a photograph taken from the car park in the Devil's Dyke on the South Downs, and I think that in the background is a windmill, and I'm feeling that might be the famous windmill that was in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. It's rather appropriate for this kind of flying. But what you can see is very nice moulded wingtip. Quite a difficult thing to make. John did a lovely job of that. And as of course you recognise those numbers, that comes from Bill Manuel. Let me crack on a bit. Another nice shot. Again, now if you look at the rudder, you see this is the added area at the top, and I think that possibly he might have been better off not adding that, because I just think that with the larger rudder, you created a bit of a doubt. There's a sort of sponginess. And whether it was twisting the fuselage or not, I don't know. But this brings us to the subject of VA. With any kind of testing of an aircraft like that, you don't know what the VA is. And certainly when I was flying it, I was very, very gingerly with the rudder. For some reason, I was just very worried about it. The pitch was lovely and very positive and got me out of problems very quickly on occasion when you got aileron reversal, you know, the incipient spin type thing, which is quite scary when you're trying to avoid hang gliders and you're a bit of the bowl and the ridge. And the ailerons reverse themselves, you know, and you're pointing at the ridge. But with the very, very effective elevator, you just pitch the nose down, the ailerons will switch back on again, and then you can roll out. And I've always advocated, you know, the need for recovery with pitch. It's a very important thing if you're getting control reversal, a roll control reversal. The rudder, normally you could always use a generous amount of rudder if you're trying to recover, as you know, recovering from some incipient spin. I was always a little bit doubtful about using too much rudder because of that added surface area. But anyway, that's just the nature of experimentals. I mean, until someone has done a really rigorous load of tests, you don't know what's going to be written in the handbook. So therefore, you stay well away from the margins, from the edges of the performance, if you see what I mean. John, in the early tests on the L2, you see the ailerons connected up inboard, so almost like sort of flaperons, except I don't think they acted as flaps. But this flew, and that was how John kind of wetted his teeth in actually building flying machines. Lovely picture of John for the pre-launch briefing, and I think they're just discussing eventualities, I'm sure. And that leads us to John's style of briefing, which I'll come to in a minute. But anyway, here's John launching from the Devil's Dyke again. You see how he's holding the bungee on a piece of rope there in his hand. He's got a thing like a lawnmower handle in his hand, and which is fine because it's very light and it just skidded off. You know, it wasn't a problem. They put some fairy liquid on the skid to help it move, and that wasn't a problem. The only thing was that there was quite a lot of tension built up in the bungees, and what he hadn't accounted for was this tiny little seat here, tiny little thing like a swing seat, and the only thing that was holding him in was this seat belt, which then crossed over in the middle and then was attached up here, and of course they stretched. So now he launched beautifully and everything else, and he was floating around, 200 or 300 feet above the countryside, the lovely Sussex countryside, with a completely slack harness on this tiny little seat. So he grabbed, I think he was probably flying with his right hand, and with his left hand he grabbed the loose harness and twisted it up in his hand into a sort of a knot, and then carried on the flying to kind of pin him back into the seat, to stop him sliding outside of the seat, basically. But anyway, carried on. But I mean, that's the nature of experimental flying. That I guess that's things. The unexpected happens. He hadn't seen that particular problem. He hadn't seen that particular problem coming. But anyway, he coped with it very, very admirably. I think that was his style. This is changing gear slightly. We're going back to the L4. And I just think that when you look at the L4 slide, after looking at the L6, the L4 looks really civilized, even though it's a biplane. But the nose cone of the L4 was from moulding from the James Bond film. It was He Only Lived Twice, and the Wallace Autogyro, which derived from a Benson. Is that right? Benson Autogyros? Yeah. And the Wallace, he was obviously did the flying for the James Bond film, and John was loaned that for his for the fairing. Apparently very lovely handling. I never flew the L4, but that's up in the museum at Flixton, so that's preserved beautifully at Flixton. This was you saw that in the drawing. The L5, which came before the L6, it was the L5 microlight. About a 40 horsepower engine pusher, 2 seats, tandem seating, plywood box fuselage, a tapering plywood box fuselage, which makes an awful lot more sense, because so much stronger if something's tapered, and a very deep wing section for lightness. So I can't remember, I don't recall at what point John had met Bill Manuel, but certainly Bill Manuel would approve of that. But then John was using a very deep section, which is what we were using on that Vulma glider, that number 2 glider that he built. But that's how he got his strength and his lightness. And that was a very light little 2-seater at a time when no one was really providing. That was 1983, sorry. That was at Popham. I think that was taken at Popham, and I saw it at Popham on the Sunday, and it's in absolute downpour rain, just like today actually. And the aircraft was outside, and it got completely waterlogged. All the fabric stretched, and it was and I think at that point John abandoned the project because of so much, all the fabric had given up. So, and I don't know what happened to it, but still a very interesting little 2-seater aircraft. Not many people developed little 2-seater aircraft that light. This was another 2-seater. We just mentioned that earlier on. All composite. Made with the vac-bag technique, and flew very nicely, lovely handling. Howard Turode will remember this. It both aerotowed and winched, and there was one built but then the group never really got pursued, unfortunately. But of course it had tremendous potential, and this was in 1980. I think it was 85, it was 86. John was doing that. Not quite sure. But it's plastic, which is obviously not so much the theme here.
Just like sitting on his lap, I think.
Yeah.
So they're very, very close together.
So now we're changing gear. We said we'd go from 1936 back to the mid 1920s, and this is a name that you will all recognise. Is anyone familiar with this aircraft? Is anyone familiar with it?
Yeah.
It was Willie Messerschmitt's. I think it was about number 2 or number 3, the thing that he designed. He got it flying, I think, in 1925. Carries 2 people. Got almost zero visibility forwards. You know, a bit like the Spirit of St. Louis. You know, but in terms of an aeroplane, the wing is, I think, a most extraordinarily advanced example. Again, we've got the straight section, which is a very easy, very safe thing to build. Going through here, but again, no strut. His solution was to shorten that distance and not have a strut. But then look at all the extra weight he's carrying. He's carrying wheels, petrol tank, engine, and a passenger. An awful lot of extra weight. So he must have really done his sums for this thing to fly on what was about 25 horsepower, the little Bristol Cherub engine, very, very low horsepower. It's not unlike John's previous experiment, but with probably about 30% less horsepower. So, you know, that's why I'm really bringing this up, because we all tend to kind of reinvent the wheels a little bit. So if this was done in 1925, we need to make sure we're not, you know, at least we're not inventing things that don't have this kind of performance. And it's flying. There's an example of it in Deutsche Museum in Munich, which is in perfect condition, and this is a replica of it. So this does the air show circuit in Germany currently. There again, you see these wings. You see the big what the Germans are obviously very switched on to these glider type wings. Again, you see the no struts. It's really those wings that could almost be, you know, a slightly smaller version of the Ollie. But this is we're talking about 1925. So I'm a big admirer of this design. Not everything is quite so glowing, because, I mean, for example, rather like rather like Fokker, you know, Fokker would have a flat area at the back of the fuselage in the early Fokkers, like the Fokker Indica, like 15, no, about a good 12 years earlier, which is all right from a structure's point of view. The only problem is with the undercarriage close together like that, typical motor glider, you know, if this wing goes down in the grass, which is not a problem, as we know from motor gliders, and you just put a little dolly or something on the wingtips, that's not a problem. But you could hit a tuft of grass, you know, with the corner of the elevator, because you can see how close that is to the ground. Do you see what I mean? And of course, that's an issue with gliders. You might not know about it, but this is a pretty delicate, fragile little area of the aircraft. So then on the next flight, what could happen to the elevator? Do you see what I mean? So I think that to me is in the gliding world, they pretty soon figured out how to get the elevators well up away from the grass, and, you know, for field landings and stuff like that. And of course we went eventually to T-tails, but it shows off the lovely deep spire. That's how he gets the strength. Very deep section. So, and this is in terms of what they did. 1926. This guy